For my money, Ursula K. Le Guin is one of the most important science fiction writers of the 20th century, and maybe the most important science fiction writer of all time. And she is one of the best examples of taking philosophical ideas and bringing them into a science fiction setting. She helped take science fiction out of the pulp era, bypassing the sometimes clinical styles of Asimov and Clarke, and told deeply human stories set on fantastic worlds. Oh, and she also wrote a genre-defining fantasy series, which for any other author would be the main event, but for Ursula K. Le Guin, it's more of a just note about her career. To really understand Ursula K. Le Guin and her ideas and how she transformed science fiction, you really have to understand what science fiction used to be. When Le Guin was born in 1929, science fiction was still firmly in the pulp era. The stories you'd find in magazines like Amazing Stories or Astounding Stories of Super Science were adventure stories. They were pulpy, full of action, and overwhelmingly male. Most readers don't go back and read this stuff, and to be honest, a lot of it isn't very good. It doesn't really hold up, but some of it does. Maybe one day I could make a video about that. While the big three of science fiction, Asimov, Clarke, and Heinlein, were moving things in a new direction, Le Guin and her cohort would actually go and push things even further. You see, Le Guin was part of a movement called the New Wave. In the New Wave, not only did you find writers who were coming from backgrounds that had not been traditionally represented in science fiction, but you also found that their interests were a little bit different than some of the older stuff in the genre. Writers like Samuel Delany, James Tiptree Jr., and of course Le Guin herself were interested in pushing science fiction into something new, and they were drawing their inspiration from psychology and philosophy, and maybe a little bit less from physics. And almost all of these writers were using science fiction to explore themes of power and identity. Now, to understand how Le Guin was able to accomplish this, you need to understand some of the ideas that formed her. First, there is Le Guin's lifelong interest in Taoism. Taoism is an ancient school of Chinese thought that stresses balance and living a harmonious life. From a very early age, Le Guin was reading the Tao Te Ching, and later on in her career, she would release a translation of it. This translation is a little bit controversial because she did not read Chinese as far as I know, but it does show that she was imbibing these ideas and wanted to help spread them. There's also the early interest in Carl Jung. While Le Guin would move past Jung in her thinking, she was deeply influenced by some of his ideas. Le Guin would stress the psychological and interior lives of her characters, and these would be woven into the plot in important ways. This is probably most obvious in the first Earthsea book. But the great philosophical love of Le Guin's life, I would say, was anarchism. Now, anarchism is a scary word. Most people associate it with bomb throwing, disorder, chaos. But the kind of anarchists that Le Guin was drawn to were anarchists who emphasized mutuality and interdependence and solidarity. It's a free association of individuals who work together for the greater good. It's a world free of hierarchy and oppression and coercion. But it would be a mistake to say that Le Guin's work is just a fictional retelling of these ideas. Obviously, she is her own thinker, she has her own ideas, and she puts those onto the page. But I think that those three schools of thought are important backgrounds for understanding where Le Guin was coming from. Now, as a young writer interested in the fantastic, Le Guin really struggled to get published. She wasn't writing the kind of literary realist fiction that editors and publishers wanted, but she also wasn't writing your typical science fiction that you could find maybe in the pulps. As a student at Radcliffe, she worked on the literary magazine, and her entire tenure there, she was never able to get a story published. I have to imagine that the editorial board of Radcliffe would eventually look back at this and just be so embarrassed because they had an opportunity to publish one of the great writers of the late 20th century, and they missed it. Eventually, an editor did take a gamble on Le Guin, and that is how we got her first published novel, Rocannon's World. Rocannon's World is kind of a strange novel for Le Guin. It's definitely not where I would suggest starting with her if you've never read her work. It's certainly more adventurous than later work, and I think it lacks that spark, that kind of genius that we find in much of Le Guin's later writing. Le Guin would go on to write 2 more books in the general setting of Rocannon's World, and this is where we see her writing in her Hainish universe. But those early Hainish cycle novels still weren't what critics were looking for, and it never really took off with audiences either. Le Guin would need to try something different if she really wanted to break out. The turning point in Le Guin's career was when she was asked to write a book for older children. And that's when Le Guin decided to take a detour from science fiction and into fantasy, and she wrote A Wizard of Earthsea. This is probably, I would say, the first great book that Le Guin wrote. It is tightly written, it has a great sense of atmosphere, and it reads well for kids and adults. I've actually talked to multiple people who have read that book and then expressed surprise to find out that it was originally written for kids. I think that one reason that Earthsea did so well for Le Guin is that Le Guin actually respected children. She didn't want to talk down to children, and she wanted to tell them a serious story with serious themes, and she succeeded, and it's why both children and adults can still read those books and get something out of them. This is also where we see Le Guin really being able to bring some of those deeper ideas into her work. As I said before, this book is heavily influenced by Carl Jung. You could almost read this book as a kind of allegory for overcoming depression. It also shows Le Guin's love of moral ambiguity, because Ged, in confronting his shadow self, is kind of the hero and the villain. This kickstarted the most fruitful part of Le Guin's career, because in the period from 1969 to 1974, Le Guin would write some of the most important novels of her life. Okay, so before we get to those novels, we need to talk about some of the historical context here, because you have to remember that the 1960s were a time of great social upheaval. Traditional norms about race and about gender and about sex, they were all changing. This allowed Le Guin and the other writers of the new wave to emerge really strongly. I mentioned before Samuel Delany and James Tiptree Jr., but there was also Michael Moorcock, Harlan Ellison, Octavia Butler. Really, there's just all these amazing writers start to emerge, and they're all challenging something about the larger world. So it would be misleading to say that Le Guin and only Le Guin was pushing science fiction forward. She was clearly part of a larger movement, but I do think she's a key figure in that movement, and you know what? I'll say it, she is my favorite science fiction writer, and so I wanted to just talk about her in this video. But someday someone should make a massive video about new wave science fiction. If you want to see that from me, you should let me know down below. Okay, so between 1969 and 1974, Le Guin would publish a litany of books. You have The Word for World is Forest, 2 more Earthsea novels, and The Lathe of Heaven. But you also have the 2 novels that I think are the best that Le Guin ever produced and her most critically acclaimed, and that's The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed. Both of these novels are also excellent. They are provocative. Like all of Le Guin's books, they are tightly written, and they really play with ambiguity in a beautiful way. Readers started to think about power and about gender and about different ways of living. Le Guin was just raising so many new topics for the reader to consider. In The Left Hand of Darkness, Guin I is an interstellar diplomat sent on behalf of the Ecomen, which is this sort of galactic cooperative between various human species. We find out through bits and pieces that humans were populated on different Earths by some kind of earlier precursor civilization. The Ecomen is trying to bind them all together so that they can all mutually benefit. So Guin I goes to the planet of Winter, which is also known as Gethin, and he wants to welcome the people of Winter into the Ecomen, but only if they're willing. But the world that Guin visits is a world of sexually monomorphic humans. So there is no differentiation between male and female, and human beings are only sexually active once every 28 days, and they can take on either a masculine or feminine role in the sexual act. So this is a world without sex, and it is a world without gender. Much of the novel is actually about Guin coming to terms with a variant of humans that is so much like him and yet so different. But we also spend a fair amount of time in another character's head, Estraven, who actually has to come to terms with Guin and how odd Guin seems to him. And yes, I said him for Estraven. This was a matter of some controversy in Le Guin's career. In The Left Hand of Darkness, she used masculine pronouns to refer to the people of Winter, even though, strictly speaking, they were neither male nor female. Later on, she would use she in another story, and she certainly reflected on this linguistic choice several times in her career. Fundamentally, The Left Hand of Darkness is a story about overcoming difference and being able to understand someone else's perspective, even if it's radically different than your own. While clearly people want to focus on it for its rather radical exploration of gender differences, I think that the main theme of The Left Hand of Darkness is actually empathy. In The Dispossessed, we also see another outsider, and that's the physicist Shevek. Shevek has grown up on Anaris, which is an anarchist world. It's a moon that orbits another world known as Eurus. Eurus is made up of various statist societies. Shevek travels to Eurus because he's interested in sharing his scientific ideas with the other physicists there. The whole book is about him struggling to understand a world of capitalism and oppression and hierarchy and coercion. And even though Le Guin is sympathetic to anarchism, she refuses to depict Anaris as just a utopia. She understands that social coercion might take the place of violence, and that's still going to stifle the individual. Using these outsiders, Le Guin is inviting the reader to look at the world differently, to think about power, to think about gender, to think about anarchy and order and capitalism and all of those big themes that we all have to deal with all of our lives. Both The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed won the Hugo and the Nebula Award, which made Le Guin the first writer to win both awards for 2 books. These books cemented Le Guin as a legend of science fiction. Guin also wrote several more Earthsea books, all of which are great, and she wrote some more realist fiction and some poetry. She even wrote another children's series about kittens that are born with wings. All of these are great and worth mentioning and worth talking about, but for Le Guin, they become almost footnotes because of how amazing some of her other work is. Now you can see the influence of Le Guin almost anywhere. Her biggest influence is probably found in the fact that science fiction has become much more socially conscious since Le Guin. I don't think you have the writings of Ian Banks in the Culture series, or China Miéville, or N.K. Jemisin, or a whole mess of writers if you didn't have Le Guin and her contemporaries. And you can also see Le Guin's influence outside of the science fiction and fantasy section at the bookstore, and in the just general literary fiction section. For Le Guin's entire career, she struggled against being pigeonholed as a genre writer. She demanded to be taken seriously. But we've actually now seen writers who are doing work that is very similar to Le Guin. I'm thinking here of like Margaret Atwood or David Mitchell, which are writing serious novels but with some fantastical elements in them. And they actually are going to get categorized in the literary fiction section of the bookstore. They actually get taken more seriously. They're up for not just science fiction and fantasy awards, but general book awards. If Le Guin and a few other writers had not blazed that trail, that wouldn't be happening. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this, please let me know down below. I'd love to make more videos like this. If you want to read more works by Le Guin or about Le Guin, I've created a reading guide down below.